Hey there, history buffs. Welcome back to WTF History, the channel where we dig into the strangest, darkest, and most jaw-dropping moments from the past. Today, we're stepping into a scene straight out of a nightmare. Paris, March 28th, 1757. The air is thick, the crowd is buzzing, and the place to grieve is packed with thousands of people. From peasants to nobles who've paid a fortune for a balcony seat. They're all here for one reason: to witness the most brutal execution in French history. At the center of it all is Robert Francois Damiens, a 42-year-old servant who did the unthinkable. He raised a knife against King Louis XV. What he did was shocking, but what's about to happen to him? It's beyond comprehension. Why did nobody risk everything to attack the king? And how did this moment change France forever? Let's dive into this twisted tale, and trust me, you're not ready for what's coming. Picture yourself standing in that crowd. The square is a sea of faces, some curious, some horrified, others just here for the spectacle. People are perched on rooftops, clinging to chimneys, straining for a view of the wooden platform in the center. Soldiers are pushing back the mob, trying to keep order, but you can feel the tension like a storm about to break. Whispers ripple through the crowd. He was possessed, someone mutters. No, it was those radical philosophers, another says. A woman nearby swears he's just insane. The man they're talking about is Robert Francois Damiens, a servant who dared to touch the untouchable, the king. His crime? A single stab with a small pocket knife, barely scratching Louis XV's skin. But in 18th century France, where the king was seen as God's chosen, even a scratch was an act of cosmic defiance. The punishment? It's not just death. It's a slow, deliberate destruction, a public show meant to remind everyone who's in charge. To understand how he got here, let's go back to Damien's beginnings. He was born in 1715 in La Feuillois, a speck of a village in northern France. His father was a gatekeeper, which tells you everything about the life Damiens was expected to lead: humble, obedient, invisible. From a young age, he worked as a servant in aristocratic households, fetching wine, cleaning boots, doing whatever the nobility demanded. But Damiens wasn't the quiet, compliant type. He had a temper, a sharp tongue, and a knack for getting fired. He'd mouth off, walk out, or just rub his employers the wrong way. Yet there were moments when he was loyal, even devoted, which makes him a puzzle. Some called him erratic, others said he was passionate. Either way, he wasn't just another faceless servant. He was watching, listening, soaking in the world around him, a world that was starting to crack. France in the 1750s was a pressure cooker. Louis XV, once called the Beloved, was losing his shine. The 7 Years' War was bleeding the country dry. Taxes were crushing the poor, and the king seemed more interested in his mistresses than his people. Enlightenment thinkers like Voltaire were stirring the pot, questioning why one man should hold absolute power just because he was born with a crown. At the same time, religious feuds were tearing France apart. The Jansenists, a strict Catholic sect, were clashing with the crown and the church, preaching against royal corruption. Seditious pamphlets trashed Louis and his mistress, Madame de Pompadour, calling her the real power behind the throne. Damiens, working in noble houses and even briefly at Versailles, was close to this chaos. He heard the gossip, the arguments, the dangerous ideas floating around. Maybe he overheard a noble reading Voltaire. Maybe he caught a tavern rant about the king's failures. Whatever it was, something was brewing inside him. Then came January 5th, 1757. It's a cold afternoon at Versailles, and Louis XV is stepping out of his carriage after visiting his sick daughter. Damiens, bundled up against the chill, slips through the crowd, pulls a small knife, and stabs the king between the ribs. The wound is shallow. Louis is wearing layers of heavy clothes, but the act is earth-shaking. The king, thinking he's just been bumped, sees blood on his hand and shouts, "I'm stabbed. Stop that man. But don't kill him." Damiens doesn't run. He stands there, almost calm, saying, "Let no one touch the king. I have something to tell him." What did he want to say? We'll never know for sure. In interrogations, he gave murky answers, something about the people suffering, something about religious disputes. He insisted he didn't mean to kill the king, that it was a protest, a gesture. But in a world where the king's body was sacred, intent didn't matter. The crown saw a threat, and they were going to crush it. The authorities dragged Damiens to the Bastille, where they tortured him for weeks, trying to uncover a conspiracy. They wanted names, plotters, proof that he wasn't acting alone. But Damiens held firm. No accomplices, no grand plan, just him. That was the scariest part. A lone servant, a nobody, daring to strike the king? It was a crack in the entire system, a sign that the monarchy's divine armor wasn't as strong as they thought. So, they crafted a punishment to match the crime's audacity. On March 26, 1757, the Parliament of Paris sentenced Damiens to a fate so horrific it was reserved for the worst of the worst. Burning, tearing, boiling liquids, and finally quartering, being ripped apart by horses. This wasn't just about killing him. It was about erasing him, body and soul, from the world. As the day of the execution approaches, you can feel the weight of what's coming, a spectacle that will sear itself into the memory of everyone who witnesses it. You're back in the place to grieve now. March 28, 1757, and the crowd is restless. The wooden platform looms in the center, and Damiens is brought out in a cart, barely recognizable after months of torture. His face is pale, his body frail. But his eyes, there's something in them, a flicker of defiance or maybe just exhaustion. The executioner, Henri Sanson, steps forward, a man whose family has been delivering death for generations. He's holding tools that make your skin crawl, red-hot pincers, a tray of molten lead, boiling oil, wax, and sulfur. The crowd falls quiet as Damiens is tied to the scaffold, his arms and legs bound tight. You can hear the creak of the ropes, the shuffle of feet, the nervous whispers. This is no ordinary execution. This is a performance, a message from the crown to anyone who dares dream of rebellion. It starts with his right hand, the one that held the knife. Sanson presses a flaming torch of sulfur to it, and the smell hits you like a punch, sharp and acrid. Damien's scream cuts through the square, raw and piercing. People flinch, some turn away, but others can't stop watching. Then come the pincers, glowing red-hot. Sanson tears into Damien's flesh, chest, arms, thighs, calves, ripping chunks where his body will later be pulled apart. The crowd's excitement is fading now, replaced by unease. You see people clutching each other, some fainting as Sanson pours a mix of molten lead, boiling oil, wax, and sulfur into the open wounds. The sizzle is sickening, and Damien's cries grow weaker. But the worst is still ahead. Even Casanova, the infamous adventurer who's seen it all, later said he went home sick and feverish from the sight. Now comes the final act, the quartering. For massive horses are led into the square, each tied to one of Damien's limbs. The plan is brutal but simple. They'll pull in opposite directions until his body gives way. The drivers crack their whips, the horses strain, hooves digging into the dirt. But Damien's body doesn't break. 5 minutes pass, then 10, then 20, and he's still intact. His screams fading into moans. The crowd is murmuring now, some whispering about divine intervention, others wondering if this punishment is too much, even for God. Sanson, visibly frustrated, approaches the magistrates watching from the sidelines. He asks for permission to make incisions at Damien's shoulders and hips to help the horses. They agree, and he takes a knife, cutting deep into the joints. The crowd gasps as the horses pull again, and finally, with a horrific sound, Damien's body is torn apart. His remains are gathered, burned to ash, and scattered, as if to wipe him from existence. As the crowd disperses, you feel numb. Some are vomiting, others walk away in silence, their faces pale. This was meant to show the king's power. But it feels like something else, a misstep, a crack in a monarchy's armor. The whispers aren't about royal strength. They're about the horror, the cruelty, the excess. You can't shake the feeling that this moment, this bloody spectacle, has changed something fundamental, even if no one can name it yet. Let's talk about Damiens himself, the man at the heart of this storm. Who was he, really? Why would a servant, trained to serve and obey, take such a reckless step? Born in 1715, Robert Francois Damiens was nobody special, at least, not at first. The son of a gatekeeper, he was destined for a life of servitude, moving from one noble household to another, doing the grunt work that kept France's aristocracy comfortable. But Damiens was different. He had a fire in him, a temper that got him in trouble. He'd argue with employers, quit jobs on a whim, or get fired for insubordination. Yet he could also be loyal, even diligent when he wanted to be. Those who knew him described him as a man of variable moods, someone who could swing from devotion to defiance in a heartbeat. He wasn't just scrubbing floors. He was paying attention, catching fragments of the world's unrest. By his 30s, Damiens had worked in some big-name places, including Versailles, the glittering heart of French power. Imagine him there, a servant among kings, watching the excess, the wealth, the casual cruelty of the court. Versailles was a world of rigid hierarchy, where nobles lived like gods while the poor starved. For a man like Damiens, with his sharp tongue and restless mind, it must have been maddening. He wasn't reading philosophy books, but he was hearing things, servants' gossip, nobles' debates, forbidden pamphlets passed around in secret. France was buzzing with dangerous ideas. Enlightenment thinkers were questioning the divine right of kings, while Jansenists railed against the crown's moral decay. Damiens, with his passion for religion and politics, soaked it all up. He'd ran about the state of the kingdom, the suffering of the people, the corruption at court. In a France where the king was God's anointed, those were fighting words. Then came that moment in January 1757. We don't know what pushed him over the edge. Maybe it was one too many stories of royal neglect. Maybe it was a religious fervor, tied to the Jansenist disputes. Or maybe he was just a man who felt invisible, desperate to be heard. Whatever it was, he acted, not with a grand plan, but with a small knife and a single, impulsive stab. He didn't try to kill Louis XV, and he didn't run afterward. His strange calm, his cryptic words about having something to tell the king, suggest he wanted to make a point. Not in a life, but the crown didn't care about his motives. They saw a servant who'd crossed a sacred line, and they were going to make him pay in a way no one would forget. The torture that followed was relentless. For nearly 2 months, Damiens was subjected to every brutal method the Bastille had to offer, all to uncover a conspiracy that didn't exist. His refusal to name accomplices only deepened the crown's fear. A lone man acting on his own was worse than a plot. It meant anyone could be a threat. The trial was a formality. The sentence a horror show designed to restore order. But as we've seen, it did the opposite. The execution, meant to terrify, left the crowd shaken and the monarchy exposed. Damiens, the nobody, had struck a blow that echoed far beyond his own life. Now let's zoom out and look at the world that shaped this moment. France in the 1750s was a nation on edge. Louis XV's reign had started with hope. He was the beloved, a young king who seemed destined for greatness. But by 1757, that glow was gone. The 7 Years' War was a disaster, draining France's wealth and pride. Taxes were crushing the poor, while the nobility and clergy sidestepped their share. Louis himself wasn't helping. He spent his days hunting, partying, and doting on Madame de Pompadour, who became a scapegoat for every failure. Pamphlets, illegal but everywhere, called her a schemer, a seductress pulling the king's strings. The people's anger wasn't just about money. It was about a king who seemed to care more about pleasure than duty. Then there were the ideas shaking things up. Enlightenment philosophers like Voltaire and Diderot were asking big questions. Why should one man rule by divine right? Why should the church and crown hold all the power? Their books and pamphlets were spreading, not just among the elite, but in taverns and markets, where ordinary people like Damiens could hear their echoes. At the same time, religious battles were raging. The Jansenists, with their strict moral code, saw the king's court as a den of sin, and their clashes with the crown were splitting society. This was the cauldron Damiens lived in, a France where faith, politics, and frustration were colliding, creating a spark that could ignite at any moment. Damiens' act was that spark. It wasn't a revolution, but it was a sign of one coming. His attack, however small, exposed the monarchy's vulnerability. The king wasn't untouchable after all, and the crown's response, over the top, barbaric, only made things worse. The execution was supposed to show strength, but it showed desperation. Philosophers pounced on it, using Damiens' suffering to argue that the monarchy was rotten. Voltaire called it grotesque. Diderot saw it as proof of a failing system. The crowd's reaction, horror, nausea, unease, showed that the old ways of ruling through fear were losing their grip. People didn't see divine justice in Damiens' torment. They saw a regime clutching at power it could no longer hold. What's incredible is how this moment marked a shift. Damiens' execution was the last of its kind in France. By the time the French Revolution erupted in 1789, just 32 years later, the guillotine had replaced the old theatrical punishments. When Louis XVI faced his own execution, it was quick, almost merciful compared to Damiens' ordeal. The revolution rejected the monarchy's brand of cruelty, favoring efficiency over spectacle. Damiens' death, meant to crush dissent, had instead planted seeds that would grow into rebellion. All right, folks, we've reached the end of this dark journey, and it's time to reflect. Robert Francois Damiens' story isn't just about one man or one execution. It's about a world on the brink, a system cracking under its own weight. The French crown thought they could silence defiance with blood, but they were wrong. Damiens' punishment didn't strengthen the monarchy. It laid bare its flaws. It showed a king so fragile that a servant's scratch required a response so extreme it turned the people against him. 200 years later, philosopher Michel Foucault opened his book Discipline and Punish with Damiens' execution, using it to show how power once worked, through raw, public violence. But that violence backfired. It didn't restore order. It sparked questions about justice, cruelty, and the right to rule. What haunts us most is the mystery of Damiens himself. Was he a religious fanatic, caught in the Jansenist fever, a revolutionary before his time, striking out against injustice, or just a man broken by a world that gave him no voice? Historians still debate it, and that's what makes him so compelling. He wasn't a hero or a villain. He was human, caught in a moment bigger than himself. His small act shook a kingdom, and his punishment, meant to erase him, made him a symbol. This wasn't just the end of a man. It was the beginning of the end for an era where kings were seen as gods. So what do you think? Was Damiens a madman, a martyr, or something else entirely? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I want to hear what you make of this wild story. If this tale blew your mind like it did mine, smash that like button, subscribe, and hit the bell so you don't miss our next dive into history's weirdest corners. This is WTF History, and I'll catch you next time for another story that'll leave you saying, what the actual heck? Stay curious, folks.